Eleanor Grace had always believed in quiet love. She wasn't the type to demand grand gestures or lavish displays of affection. She believed love was in the little things, in the way she packed Thomas's lunch every morning before he went to work, in how she folded his shirts just the way he liked, in the way she kept the house warm and welcoming. Even during the coldest winters of their marriage, they had met when she was just 27, a librarian with dreams of writing poetry, and he was a 30-year-old mechanic with oil-stained hands and a charming, boyish smile that made her heart flutter. Their love hadn't been whirlwind or poetic. It was steady, reliable. She thought that was enough. In those early days, Thomas would bring her wildflowers picked from the roadside and leave notes in her books. "To my Eleanor," he would write, "the woman who brings peace to my chaos." And for a time, those small acts of love nourished her soul. They married the following year, moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, and slowly built a life together. Children came, to boys who grew tall and strong, and with them came responsibility, fatigue, and the kind of constant movement that left little time for gazing into each other's eyes. Eleanor traded her poetry notebooks for grocery lists and chore charts. She cooked, cleaned, taught their children to read and pray. Thomas worked long hours, and slowly, the sweet gestures faded. The flowers stopped coming. The notes disappeared, but Eleanor didn't complain. She told herself this was life. This was marriage. 40 years would pass in this rhythm, a quiet, persistent hum of duty and domesticity. There were cracks, of course, subtle, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. Sometimes Thomas came home irritable, snapping over small things like dinner not being hot enough or the remote not in its usual spot. There were moments when Eleanor felt more like a housekeeper than a wife, but she brushed it aside. Everyone had their flaws. Everyone had their days. Besides, he was loyal. He never left. He always came back home. Their silver wedding anniversary was a modest affair. Eleanor cooked his favorite meal, wore the navy blue dress he once said made her look like a movie star, and baked the chocolate cake from their honeymoon in Vermont. Thomas barely noticed the dress. He ate the meal with a distracted air, staring at the television. He did say, "Thank you for the cake. That was nice," he mumbled, mouth half full, before retreating to bed. Still, she smiled, because she had trained herself to find joy in crumbs. The years that followed brought health scares, financial ups and downs, and the kind of weariness that settles into the bones of the elderly. Eleanor developed arthritis in her hands. Thomas lost interest in everything but sports and napping. Their sons moved away, married, and began lives of their own. Holidays became quieter, the house echoing with memories rather than laughter. Eleanor began to feel like wallpaper, always there, always fading, never noticed. She poured herself into routines, morning tea on the porch, watching birds at the feeder, watering the plants, reading novels with characters who had wild, dramatic lives. She rarely wrote anymore. Her poetry journals lay untouched in the attic, collecting dust and cobwebs. There was no space in her world for verse, not when meals had to be made, medications managed, bills paid, and yet, despite the dull ache of disappointment, she remained devoted. She still loved him. She told herself that this was what loyalty meant, staying even when the fire was out, giving even when nothing was returned. She imagined their story ending like those old romantic films, two aged souls holding hands, rocking in chairs, thankful for a life lived together. But even as she imagined that ending, reality was shifting. She noticed Thomas's restlessness. He started spending more time away from home. Long drives, with no explanation. New clothes, a cologne she didn't recognize. He began locking his phone, which was strange, considering he used to forget where he even left it. Eleanor felt the chill of suspicion creep into her heart, but pushed it aside. After all, she was 6, he was 70, who would start a new chapter now. She remembered a Sunday morning when he said he was going to visit an old friend in a nearby town. Something in his voice was off-forced, rehearsed. She didn't question him. She simply nodded and handed him his scarf. "Drive safe," she said, her voice kind. He didn't meet her eyes. When he left, she sat in the living room with her knitting needles clutched in her fingers, unmoving. The clock ticked loudly. The silence was heavier than ever before. That was the day she first allowed herself to say it not aloud. But in her heart, something was wrong. Still, she did not confront him. Confrontation felt beneath her dignity. Or maybe she was afraid that everything she had built, everything she had given would crumble if the truth came out. She chose to protect the illusion, until the day the illusion shattered on its own. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Thomas had left for the pharmacy, but had taken nearly 2 hours. Eleanor went to place his folded laundry in his drawer and found it slightly ajar. His phone was inside. It buzzed once. A message flashed on the screen. I miss you already. Last night was perfect. Yours, Ivy. Her heart stopped. Literally, for a moment, it felt like it stopped. She sat down on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, trying to breathe. The walls around her felt like they were closing in. Her fingers trembled. There were more messages, dozens, full of flirtation, longing, and memories of secret meets. Eleanor read them all. Every word cut like glass. She felt something inside her break. Not just her heart, her identity, her belief in their life, her confidence in herself. It was as if 40 years were being erased by a younger woman's lipstick and lies. She did not cry immediately. She placed the phone back, folded the drawer, walked into the kitchen, sat at the table. The kettle whistled on the stove, but she didn't move to turn it off. Her mind was a swirl of images. Christmases spent together, vacations at the lake, the day he held their firstborn son. Did none of it mean anything to him? Was she just a placeholder until something better came along? When Thomas returned, she didn't scream, she didn't throw things, she simply looked at him and said, "Who is Ivy?" His face changed. Gone was the relaxed, lazy expression. In its place was guilt, quickly masked by defensiveness. "Don't go through my phone," he said. She laughed bitterly. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. "That's your answer?" He shrugged. "Look, Eleanor, I didn't plan for this, but Ivy makes me feel alive again. She sees me." Eleanor's voice shook. "And what have I been doing all these years? Folding your clothes, cooking your meals, growing old alone in a marriage you abandoned long ago." He had no answer. He moved out the next week. No goodbye, no apology, just a suitcase and a slammed door. 40 years of loyalty left behind like yesterday's news. Eleanor sat on the same porch where she had once dreamed of sunsets with him. Only now, the tea tasted bitter. The birds seemed quieter. The house, colder. She felt foolish, used, replaced. But, buried beneath the sorrow, a strange feeling began to grow. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. A spark, not of hope, of anger. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that builds. The kind that reshapes broken things into something stronger. The kind that said, "This isn't how my story ends." And in that quiet moment of betrayal and bitterness, Eleanor took the first breath of a new beginning. Eleanor's mornings had changed. They no longer started with the familiar rustling of Thomas in the bathroom, or the smell of his aftershave lingering in the hallway. Now, there was silence. A silence so thick it pressed against her chest like a weight. The house, once shared, felt like a mausoleum of memories. Every room carried the scent of him, the sound of him, and the betrayal he left behind. His slippers still sat by the front door, untouched. His favorite chair remained in its usual place in the living room, slightly tilted, the way he liked it. She hadn't moved anything yet. She wasn't sure she could. The night after Thomas left, Eleanor didn't sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, her mind playing a cruel reel of old memories, their wedding, the birth of their sons, the night he stayed up with her when she had the flu. Each memory once made her feel safe. Now, they only mocked her. The following morning, she got out of bed not out of will, but habit. She boiled water for tea, poured it into 2 cups before stopping and realizing she was alone. She poured the second cup down the sink, ashamed at the automatic gesture. It hurt how even her hands hadn't caught up with reality yet. She sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the chair across from her. It stared back, empty and indifferent. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her son, Adam. "Hey Mom, how are you? Heard from Dad lately." She didn't reply. She couldn't. The words would have broken her. She couldn't tell her sons yet. She didn't know how. What would she say? That their father had thrown away 40 years of marriage for a woman probably younger than both of them. That he'd chosen lust over loyalty, thrill over stability. No, not yet. Asterisk later that day, she wandered into their bedroom. The bed was still made, but the absence on his side was glaring. She opened his wardrobe. Half the clothes were gone, so he had planned this. She wondered how many nights he had lain next to her while secretly texting Ivy. How many lies he told, with a straight face. How many meals he ate with her while longing for someone else. The betrayal ran deep, not because he left, but because he had erased her without a second thought. Asterisk Eleanor spent that afternoon going through old photo albums. Their honeymoon in Vermont, when she wore that silly sun hat he adored. The Christmas in 1985 when their youngest had the flu, and they spent the entire day in bed reading books aloud. The photo from their 25th anniversary, when he'd kissed her cheek so gently. Lies, all of it. That's what she thought now. Were all those smiles real? Or was she just the background in his performance? Asterisk for the next few days, Eleanor functioned like a ghost. She moved through the house without purpose. She cooked less, ate even less. The plants on the porch wilted. She stopped brushing her hair. She avoided mirrors. Every time she looked into one, she saw the same question staring back. What's wrong with me? Asterisk, that question echoed through every corner of her soul. What did Ivy have that she didn't? Was it her age? Her skin? Her energy? Did Eleanor become invisible the moment she turned 60? She had spent her life nurturing a man, raising children, maintaining a home only to be discarded like a cracked porcelain teacup. Still pretty, but not worth keeping. Asterisk one evening, a neighbor named June knocked on her door with a casserole. Just thought you might like something warm, she said kindly. Eleanor forced a smile, took the dish, and said thank you. But she didn't invite her in. She couldn't bear the pity. In June's eyes, everyone would know soon. And once they knew, they'd whisper. They'd shake their heads and say, poor Eleanor, left for someone younger. She didn't want to become anyone's sad story. Not yet. Asterisk that night, as she sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, she found herself crying without warning, not sobbing, just quiet tears that fell one by one, soaking her cheeks and dripping onto her lap. She missed him. Despite everything, she missed him. She missed the sound of his keys in the door, his humming in the shower, the way he used to hold her hand during long drives. Asterisk, but she also hated him. Asterisk, the contradiction tore her apart. Asterisk, the next morning, she found herself sitting in the attic. Dust covered the boxes and old trunks. She hadn't been up there in years. She opened one of the boxes labeled Eleanor Writing. Inside were her old journals, notebooks, and poetry drafts. Pages and pages of words written by a younger version of herself. Words filled with hope, passion, creativity. She had been a dreamer once. She remembered now. She'd wanted to publish a poetry book, travel to Paris, teach literature, but those dreams had slowly faded under layers of diapers, dinner plans, and compromise. Asterisk, she picked up a notebook and began to read. One poem caught her eye. Asterisk, they say love is patient, love is kind, but no one tells you love can be blind, blind to the years it steals in hush. Asterisk, to the dreams it buries beneath the rush. Asterisk, her own words, written when she was barely 30. How had she known then what would come? She read for hours, long past sunset. Her tears didn't fall this time. Instead, a strange calm settled over her. These poems weren't just words, they were pieces of her preserved, waiting to be found again. Asterisk, over the following days, Eleanor began a small ritual. Every morning, she made herself a single cup of tea. She sat by the window, read one old poem, and wrote a new one. Her words were different, now older, sharper, less naive, but they were hers, and they were honest. Asterisk, she also began to clean, not just the house, but her life. She donated Thomas's old clothes, took down pictures of them together, replaced the couple's photo on the mantel with a photograph of her and her sister from their childhood. She sorted through papers, threw out expired spices, rearranged furniture. With each task, a little weight lifted. The house began to breathe again, not as a shared space but as hers. Asterisk, then one afternoon, she saw Ivy for the first time. She was at the local supermarket. Eleanor noticed her immediately, tall blonde, dressed in a tight green blouse, talking animatedly into her phone. She couldn't be more than 5. Eleanor froze, heart pounding. She waited until Ivy walked past without noticing her, then stood for a moment staring at the cereal boxes, hands shaking. Seeing her made everything real, and strangely, it made Eleanor feel powerful. Asterisk, This was the woman her husband had thrown everything away for. This girl, with perfectly manicured nails and glossy lips, she didn't look extraordinary. In fact, she looked ordinary, temporary, like something Thomas would one day tire of just as he had tired of her. Eleanor walked out of the supermarket without buying anything, but her head was held higher than when she had walked in. She realized then that this wasn't about Ivy. It wasn't even about Thomas. It was about Eleanor. What she had allowed, what she had endured, what she had lost, what she could still reclaim. She spent that evening writing. Her poem was titled Unbecoming. It spoke of a woman shedding layers not to become someone new, but to return to who she had always been beneath the expectations, the roles, the labels. She signed it with her name, full and unashamed Eleanor Grace. The sadness was still there. Of course, it came in waves, sometimes crashing when she least expected. But now, the waves no longer dragged her under. She was learning to float. In the solitude of her days, she began to recognize herself again, not the wife, not the mother, just Eleanor, the woman who had been forgotten even by herself. And somewhere, in that quiet rediscovery, a seed was planted. A seed not of revenge, not yet, but of strength, the kind that blooms slowly, silently, but cannot be ignored forever. Eleanor had always believed that heartbreak made itself known with a loud crack, a moment so severe and dramatic that it would split her open instantly. But the truth was far more haunting. The real pain settled in quietly, in small moments, that made her question her very existence. Chapter 3 of her life began with the slow realization that nothing was going to be the same ever again. It had been 3 weeks since Thomas had left. The official story was still neatly tucked away, hidden from friends and family, wrapped in silence. Eleanor had told no one, not even her sons. She couldn't bring herself to explain how the man who had vowed to stay with her forever had simply walked out for someone young, vibrant, and utterly new. There was something profoundly shameful about being left at 66. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the implication that she was no longer enough. Each day blurred into the next. Morning merged with afternoon, and by evening, she often found herself sitting in the same chair she'd been in when the sun rose, not having moved except to make tea or stare blankly at the television. The house echoed with the ghosts of their shared life. Thomas's laugh from another room, the sound of his slippers dragging against the tile floor, the familiar jingle of his keys. These sounds didn't actually occur, but they haunted her like an old melody she couldn't get out of her head. Then came the day that would break the illusion entirely. It began like any other. Eleanor rose early, out of habit rather than energy, and prepared herself a simple breakfast: toast, soft-boiled egg, and tea. She sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old gardening magazine when her landline rang. It was an old rotary model, a gift from Thomas years ago when he claimed mobile phones made people forget real conversations. Irony, now, wasn't lost on her. She answered the call with her usual cautious voice. Hello, Mrs. Grace. The woman's voice was polite but distant. Yes. This is Julia, from Citibank. I just wanted to confirm some recent changes to your joint account. Eleanor's heart paused mid-beat. What changes? The woman paused. Well, Mr. Grice came in this morning. He removed himself from the joint account and opened a new one. We just wanted to ensure you were aware, especially with auto payments still connected to the original account. Her throat tightened. She couldn't breathe for a moment. I was not aware, she whispered. Would you like to schedule an appointment to review your account security and make any necessary changes? Yes, Eleanor said, though the word felt foreign and hollow. After the call ended, she sat there in a stunned silence, her tea now cold. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. So, it was real. It wasn't a midlife crisis. It wasn't temporary. He had removed himself financially, officially, completely. He was building a new life without her. That afternoon, she went to the bank. Julia, a kind-eyed woman in her 30s, guided her through the process. Eleanor signed papers, closed, shared accounts, and changed passwords she didn't even remember creating. Each click and signature felt like a nail in the coffin of her old life. She walked out of the bank not as a wife, but as a widow of the living. The walk back home was long and quiet. Trees lined the street like sentinels bearing witness to her unraveling. Neighbors passed by, waving. She waved back with a practiced smile, masking the wreckage beneath her ribs. She had become a master of appearing fine. No one needed to know that she was unraveling from the inside out. When she returned home, the first thing she did was sit in the living room and stare at the wedding photograph on the mantel. It was taken in black and white. Thomas looked so young, so sure of himself. She looked radiant, hopeful. A woman who had no idea the promise being made would one day be broken so carelessly. She took the frame down. Not in anger. In mourning. She wrapped it in newspaper and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. It hurt too much to look at that version of herself, the one who believed love would be enough. The days that followed were more difficult than the ones before. The shock had passed. Now came the waves of grief. They were relentless, arriving. Without warning, she'd be washing dishes and suddenly remember how Thomas used to sneak up behind her and kiss her neck. She'd be in the garden and hear his voice calling out, asking where she kept the pruning shears, and worst of all, she started hearing Ivy's name in her head. Ivy. A name that had wedged itself like a thorn in her memory. Eleanor didn't know much about her, except what she had seen in the messages. Ivy used heart emojis and signed off with pet names. She was flirty and confident, filled with energy Eleanor hadn't felt in years, and most of all, she was everything Thomas had chosen over her. One afternoon, Eleanor opened a drawer in her writing desk and found a dusty box of photographs. She hadn't looked at them in years. They were from their early travels, trips to lakes, mountains, vineyards. In each photo, Eleanor was smiling. So was Thomas. They looked like a couple who had it all. But now, with the truth unraveled, she began to see something different. Her smile was often reaching, forced. His eyes were frequently somewhere else. How long had he been disconnected? How long had she pretended not to notice? That night, Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch. The moon was bright, casting a silver glow across the lawn. The garden was overgrown now, as neglected as her marriage had been. She sipped slowly and let the tears fall freely. Not for Thomas, not even for Ivy. She cried for Eleanor, for the woman who had given everything, who had dimmed her light to let someone else shine, who had silenced her dreams for the sake of harmony, who had clung to a man that had slowly let go of her long before he walked out the door. And then, just like that, the sorrow gave way to something new, not rage, clarity. Thomas was gone, and while his betrayal hurt, it had also freed her from a life of waiting, from silence, from compromise. For years she had tiptoed around his moods, adjusted herself to fit the mold of a good wife. And what had it earned her? A back turned, a door slammed, and love replaced by someone younger. But now, she was in charge of her story. That same night, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in decades. She went to her attic, found an old typewriter her father had given her when she was a teenager, and cleaned it off. She pulled out a stack of unused paper and sat at the kitchen table. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, uncertain. And then she began to type. It wasn't poetry. Not at first. It was raw, disjointed thoughts, letters to herself, truths she had buried, phrases like "you are still worthy" and "he left, but you remained." With each keystroke, her heart grew. Lighter words poured out of her like floodwaters finally finding release. She wrote until her fingers ached and her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but she felt alive. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor Grace wasn't shrinking to fit into someone else's life. She was writing her own, no longer a supporting character in Thomas's narrative. She was taking the lead in her own. The next morning, she called her son, Adam. "Come visit this weekend," she said. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked. She paused. "No," she said honestly, "but it will be." When she hung up, she stood by the window and looked out at the garden. Weeds had overtaken the rose bushes. Ivy ironically was spreading along the brick wall. She smiled bitterly at the symbolism. But this time, she wasn't afraid, because Eleanor had been shattered, yes, but she wasn't staying broken. Not for him. Not for anyone. And in that moment, she made a promise not to get revenge. Not yet, but to reclaim everything she had given up. One word at a time. Eleanor had once believed that pain would peak and then fade, like a storm that leaves as quickly as it comes. But what she hadn't prepared for was the ache that lingered, not like thunder, but like a persistent drizzle that never stopped, slowly soaking everything. Each day after the confrontation with Thomas was quieter, heavier, not because she hadn't heard from him, but because he acted as if she had never mattered. No messages, no calls, no regrets. He had moved on swiftly, without hesitation, as if she was an old piece of furniture finally discarded after years of use. That realization that someone you loved could erase you so efficiently was more haunting than the betrayal itself. Eleanor tried to maintain routines. She found comfort in structure. Breakfast at 8, garden work by 9, reading by 11. But the days stretched endlessly. Meals were mechanical. Books lost their charm. Even the plants, once her pride, seemed to droop as though mourning with her. The house, though filled with her belongings, no longer felt like a home. It felt like a tomb of a shared life that had suddenly died. There were days she would find herself standing in front of the mirror for long moments, simply staring. The face that looked back at her seemed like a stranger. The wrinkles, once symbols of laughter and years lived, now looked like reminders of what she could no longer offer. She would touch her own cheeks and wonder, when did I become invisible? She began to go through old drawers, organizing things she had avoided for years. One evening, while clearing a cabinet near the hallway, she stumbled upon a box she didn't remember keeping. Inside were receipts, cards, and photographs. Among them was a letter in Thomas's handwriting, dated nearly 20 years ago. Anniversary letter. He had written, I don't know where I would be without you. You are my anchor in every storm. You gave up your dreams so I could live mine. I promise I'll make it worth it. Eleanor read that letter over and over until the ink seemed to blur. Then she folded it back neatly and placed it in the box without a word. That letter once made her heart flutter. Now, it made her stomach turn. It wasn't just that he broke his promise. It was the way he had made her feel foolish for believing it. The betrayal wasn't about Ivy being young or beautiful. It was about the fact that Eleanor had built her entire identity around being a good wife, and in return, Thomas had walked away without remorse. He had turned her loyalty into a burden, and she had let him. The emotional weight began to take a toll. Physically, her appetite withered, her energy dipped. She started losing weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her thinning frame. Neighbors noticed. June, the kind woman who had brought a casserole weeks ago, stopped by again. You're not yourself, Eleanor, she said gently, eyes filled with concern. Eleanor forced a smile. I don't think I remember who that is anymore. June didn't push. She simply squeezed Eleanor's hand and said, You're still here. That counts for something. That night, Eleanor stood on her porch under the stars. The sky was vast, cloudless, scattered with brilliant pinpricks of lights. She remembered how, in the early years of their marriage, she and Thomas would sit on this same porch and talk about dreams, traveling to Europe, building a cabin by a lake, learning to dance. None of it had ever happened, not because of poverty or hardship, but because there was always something else, more urgent, more practical. Dreams were sacrificed on the altar of routine. Now, with time slipping through her fingers, she felt betrayed not just by Thomas but by herself. The realization stung. She had given up too much. The next day, she opened her closet and stared at her clothes. Most of them were plain, practical, and outdated. She realized she hadn't bought anything for herself in years only, things Thomas liked. She pulled out a dress she hadn't worn in over a decade. It was burgundy, with delicate lace at the cuffs. She had once loved the way it hugged her waist, the way it made her feel seen. She slipped it on. It was looser now, but it still held a whisper of the woman she used to be. She looked at herself in the mirror again, still older, still worn, but something in her eyes had changed. There was pain, yes, but also a flicker of defiance. She decided to go into town that afternoon. It was a small gesture, but for Eleanor, it was a declaration. She would not be erased. She visited the bookstore she used to frequent in her 30s. The owner, Mr. Hargrove, recognized her instantly. Eleanor, Grace, been a while, he said warmly. I needed something new, she replied. She wandered through the aisles, trailing her fingers across spines, the smell of paper and ink comforting. She picked up a few novels and a slim volume of poetry. She hadn't read poetry in years. That evening, she sat by the fireplace and read aloud to herself. The verses spoke of longing, aging, solitude, and survival. It stirred something within her. A memory, a version of herself that still lived beneath the hurt, a version that hadn't been nurtured in decades. Eleanor began to write again. At first, it was hesitant. Her hands shook as she gripped the pen. She scribbled ideas on napkins, receipts, the back of utility bills. Then she found a leather-bound notebook buried in her study drawer, nearly empty, and claimed it as her own. Each morning, she wrote. Some entries were fragments, others, full poems. The words didn't erase the pain, but they helped her carry it. She also started walking. Nothing ambitious. Just short walks around the neighborhood in the early evening. People noticed. Some waved. Some stopped to chat. They didn't ask questions, but they could see the change. The woman who had once seemed shrunken by sadness was slowly re-emerging, not whole, not healed, but no longer drowning. Then one day, while walking past the florist, she saw Thomas. He was inside, holding a bouquet. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked older, somehow more tired, less sure of himself. Ivy wasn't with him. Eleanor stood still, unseen from where she was, watching through the glass. He handed over the cash, took the flowers, and turned toward the exit. For a moment, their eyes met. It was brief, a flicker of recognition. Guilt flashed across his face, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She simply nodded. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, but she had already started walking away. She didn't need to hear whatever apology or explanation he might offer. She didn't want it. It wouldn't be for her benefit. It would be to relieve his own guilt, and Eleanor had carried enough of his weight. She returned home and, for the first time since he left, took down the framed wedding vows from the bedroom wall. She placed them in a box and carried it out to the garage. The past would always live inside her, but it would no longer decorate her life. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "There is an emptiness I never asked for, but inside that emptiness, I have space, now space to become something new." She sat on the porch again, but this time, not to mourn. She watched the stars and allowed herself to imagine what came next, not as part of a couple, not as someone's wife, but as Eleanor Grace, a woman scarred, but still standing, alone, but not broken. She poured herself a glass of wine and toasted the sky, to the silence, to the suffering, to the survival, to the bloom that would one day rise from this heartbreak. It was not yet time for revenge, but it was time for reckoning. The morning that marked the beginning of Eleanor's transformation arrived like any other, quiet and grey, with a gentle drizzle kissing the windows. But something felt different. As she sipped her tea alone, her eyes rested on the chair where Thomas used to sit. There was no sting this time, no ache in her chest, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but from acceptance. She didn't miss him anymore, not in the way that a woman longs for a lover, but in the way someone might mourn an illusion. He wasn't the man she thought he was. Maybe he never had been. It had taken weeks of crying, of silence, of aching, loneliness to get here. Weeks of tracing her pain back through memories, only to discover how often she had compromised herself in the name of keeping peace. She had given up friendships because Thomas didn't like too many people around. She had refused teaching offers because they would have interfered with his schedule. She had buried her creativity in service of his comfort. Now, she saw it for what it was, not love, but erasure. She had spent a lifetime dimming her light so someone else could shine. But that morning, Eleanor decided she was done waiting for permission to reclaim herself. After breakfast, she walked into the attic once again. It was dusty and dim, filled with forgotten boxes and remnants of a life she'd nearly abandoned. She found the old canvas bag that held her painting supplies. Once upon a time, she'd painted almost every week: landscapes, flowers, even abstract expressions of her moods. She remembered the satisfaction of swirling color onto a blank canvas, of watching something come alive from nothing. The brushes were stiff with dried paint. The paints were crusted, but still usable. The sketchbook had blank pages left. She carried them downstairs, placed them on the kitchen table, and stared at them for a while. She didn't paint that day, but she had taken the first step. Over the next few days, Eleanor made changes. Small ones at first. She changed the curtains in the living room to a lighter shade. She moved the armchair closer to the fireplace. She started playing music in the mornings, classical mostly, though some jazz crept in now and then. The silence in the house slowly softened. It wasn't the silence of abandonment anymore, it was the quiet of peace. And then she painted it. Started with a single brushstroke, hesitant, crooked, but honest. She painted a tree, wind-blown and leaning, yet deeply rooted. It wasn't perfect. The lines were shaky, the colors too bold in places, but it was real. She cried while painting it, not because she was sad, but because she had forgotten how good it felt to create something that wasn't for anyone else, something that was entirely hers. Each day after that, she painted a little more. Her kitchen table transformed into a studio. Sketches piled up. Her fingers were always stained with color. The house started to smell like turpentine and coffee. For the first time in decades, she had something to look forward to in the morning. But creativity wasn't the only thing returning to her. Confidence followed. She went shopping for the first time in months and bought herself a deep plum scarf and a pair of shoes that clicked confidently on the pavement. She wore her hair loose instead of tying it up in the tight, neat bun Thomas always preferred. She began experimenting with makeup again, just a hint of color, just enough to see herself differently in the mirror. When she looked at her reflection, she no longer saw just a discarded wife. She saw a woman who had survived. Word began to spread through the neighborhood that Eleanor Grace was finding herself again. June came over one afternoon and nearly wept when she saw Eleanor's paintings. "You should show these," she said. "People need to see this beauty." Eleanor laughed. "People? I'm not even sure I'm ready to see it." June tilted her head. "Maybe not yet, but soon." One afternoon, while Eleanor was walking in the park, she bumped into Margaret Bell, a woman she hadn't spoken to in years. They had once been close, until Thomas had labeled Margaret as too opinionated. And Eleanor, eager to keep the peace, had slowly distanced herself. Margaret greeted her warmly. "I've heard about what happened," she said carefully. Eleanor didn't flinch. "It's true. He left me for someone half my age." Margaret touched her arm gently. "Then, he's a fool." They talked for hours that day, seated on a bench under a large oak tree. Eleanor poured out everything, her heartbreak, her shame, her rediscovery. Margaret listened without judgment, sometimes nodding, sometimes wiping away a tear. Before they parted, Margaret said, "You're more alive now than I've ever seen you." That night, Eleanor stood in front of her bedroom mirror and really looked at herself, not with pity, but with curiosity. The wrinkles were still there. So were the age spots, the thinning hair, the soft folds around her eyes. But now she saw beauty in them. Proof of a life lived, of pain survived, of wisdom earned. The next morning she made a bold decision. She would redecorate not just the furniture. Her life, she began by clearing out the master bedroom. She removed all traces of Thomas, the tie rack, the cufflink box, the drawer filled with decades-old receipts. She even removed the wedding photo that had once hung above the bed. In its place, she hung her first painting, the wind-blown tree. She ordered new bedsheets, soft ones in a rich emerald green. She painted one wall, a light honey oak. She replaced the bedside lamp with a modern one that flickered like candlelight. She began reading again in bed, not romance novels, but travel memoirs and books on women who had reinvented themselves. With each small change, the house stopped being a monument to what she had lost and started becoming a celebration of what she was reclaiming. Her sons, Adam and Joel, finally visited one weekend. She had delayed telling them the full truth, but now she was ready. They sat at the table over coffee as she explained what had happened. Their eyes grew wide, shocked, angry. "Are you okay?" Adam asked, reaching across the table to hold her hand. Eleanor smiled. "I wasn't, but I'm getting there." Joel looked around the house, noticing the changes. "This place feels different." "It is," she said softly. They stayed longer than usual, helping her clean the garage and rearrange the furniture. They hugged her tighter when they left. And that night, for the first time, Eleanor didn't cry after saying goodbye to them. Instead, she wrote. In her journal, she penned a letter to herself, not the Eleanor of now, but the Eleanor from a year ago. She wrote about the strength she didn't know she had, about the art waiting inside her, about the beauty in blooming again after devastation. She ended the letter with a line she had once read in a novel but never understood until now. "Rock bottom is a firm place to build," and build she would. The days continued to pass, and Eleanor kept painting. She even started attending a local art class for senior women. They welcomed her with open arms. Some were widows, some divorced. All carried stories of love, loss, and becoming. In their presence, Eleanor felt less alone. She laughed again. Real, belly-deep laughs that made her eyes water. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Then one afternoon, as she was walking home from the art center, she saw Thomas again. He was seated on a bench with Ivy beside him, but they weren't holding hands, they weren't laughing. Ivy was on her phone, and Thomas looked tired, not just physically, but spiritually. His shoulders slumped, his eyes dull. Eleanor stood for a moment, unnoticed. She wasn't angry, she wasn't sad. She simply felt nothing. And in that nothing, she'd found everything. Thomas hadn't destroyed her, he had freed her. The woman he left was gone. In her place stood someone entirely new, someone who knew the worth of her own voice, her own hands, her own soul. When she walked away, she didn't look back. At home, she opened her journal again. This time, she wrote a poem. They buried me in silence, but I bloomed in my own noise. They left me in the dark, but I found the light inside. They said it was over, but it had only begun. That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch, sipping tea, watching the stars appear. She was no longer a woman waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. Eleanor woke up that morning to the sound of rain gently tapping against her bedroom window. The sound wasn't sorrowful anymore. It felt rhythmic, almost musical, like a quiet drum roll for something long awaited. As she sat up, the scent of lavender from her new bedsheets filled the room, a small joy, one she had chosen for herself, not for anyone else. The house felt warmer now, not because the weather had changed, but because she had. Every inch of it carried her fingerprint, her soul, her independence. There was a new painting on the wall beside her bed, one she had completed the night before. It was bold, full of reds and oranges and gold, almost fiery. A phoenix rising from ash, with wings stretched wide, unapologetic in its flight. It wasn't subtle or safe, and that was the point. Eleanor had stopped painting soft landscapes. She was painting her truth now. She stretched her arms, stood barefoot on the wooden floor, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, less fragile, more focused. The lines on her face were still there, but now they looked carved by wisdom, not weathered by abandonment. Her gray hair fell freely around her shoulders. She touched it, remembering how she used to dye it regularly because Thomas thought women should age gracefully, not visibly. Now, she embraced the silver strands. They told her story. By mid-morning, she was in her studio space, the dining room turned, room mixing colors, humming a tune. Her phone rang. It was June, her ever-loyal neighbor. You won't believe this, June said, her voice full of quiet glee. I saw Ivy in town, with another man, not Thomas. Eleanor paused, her brush hanging in the air. Another man. Looked much younger. They were holding hands. Eleanor didn't feel the anger she expected. Instead, she felt an eerie sense of confirmation. Something she had felt deep down had now surfaced into reality. Ivy wasn't the type to stay. She was the kind of person who passed through lives, like a breeze, exciting, refreshing, but never permanent. That afternoon, Eleanor walked into town for some fresh air and to pick up new brushes. The art store had become a sacred place for her, a temple of sorts. The man behind the counter, Theo, always greeted her with the warmth of someone who truly saw her. Back for more, he asked, smiling. I've worn down 3 brushes this week, she replied with a proud smirk. You're on fire lately, Theo said. Have you considered showing your work? We have a community gallery event next month. Eleanor blinked. You think it's good enough? I think you're good enough, he said, simply. Her heart fluttered a little, not romantically, but with the thrill of being seen for her talent, her voice, not her history. She told him she'd think about it and left the shop with a brown paper bag full of supplies and a seed of possibility planted in her mind. That evening, after dinner, she walked past the house she and Thomas had shared for so long, viewing it now with new eyes. She realized something odd. Despite him being gone, she no longer wished for him to return. In fact, the idea of him re-entering her life felt like a threat to the peace she had carefully rebuilt. This house was hers, now in spirit, in energy, in identity. When she reached her porch, she noticed an envelope tucked under the doormat. It was handwritten, no stamp. She opened it cautiously. Eleanor, I know I don't deserve your time or words, but I wanted to try. Ivy left. I didn't see it coming. Maybe I should have. I've made a mess of everything. I was wondering if we could talk sometime. I miss you. I miss the home. Thomas. Eleanor stared at the words without blinking. For a long time, she felt nothing. Then slowly, her emotions began to churn, not in heartbreak, but in clarity. So it had happened. Just as June had said. He was alone now. Ivy had moved on, and Thomas, predictable as ever, had returned to the place of comfort he'd taken for granted. But she was no longer there. Not the old Eleanor, not the one who waited with warm meals and warm forgiveness. That woman had been burned to the ground. What stood in her place was someone Thomas no longer knew. She folded the letter and placed it inside her journal. She didn't cry. She didn't call him. She didn't even feel tempted to respond. Instead, she painted that night with more fire than ever. Her canvas became a storm, chaotic streaks of black and crimson, purple lightning splitting the sky. In the center, a woman standing alone on a cliff, wind whipping her hair, her arms open wide, not in desperation, but in triumph. The next morning, she mailed her application to the gallery event. She titled her submission, The Woman Who Stayed When He Left. The gallery confirmed her acceptance within a week. They asked for 3 paintings and a short artist bio. Writing that biography was unexpectedly emotional. She struggled at first to define herself without referencing Thomas, or the betrayal, or the marriage. But eventually, the words came. Eleanor Grace is a self-taught artist rediscovering her voice in the latter season of life. Her work explores transformation, grief, and self-possession. She paints not to escape her past, but to honor the version of herself that waited patiently to bloom. She read it over several times, smiling with quiet satisfaction. On the day of the gallery, she wore the deep plum scarf again, this time paired with a linen blouse and wide-leg slacks. She tied her hair loosely at the back, letting wisps fall naturally around her face. She looked at herself in the mirror and whispered, "You're not broken, you're becoming." The gallery buzzed with people. Some admired her work. Some asked about her process. A few were visibly moved. One woman stood staring at the cliff, painting for almost 10 minutes before turning to Eleanor with glassy eyes. "That's me," the woman said softly. "That's me." Eleanor nodded, understanding completely. Later, as she stood alone near her display, sipping sparkling water, she felt a presence behind her. She turned. It was Thomas. He looked older, thinner, tired. His clothes were wrinkled. His eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on her. "I saw your name in the event list," he said. Eleanor said nothing. "I didn't know you painted," he added, looking at the canvases. "You never asked," she replied. He looked away, embarrassed. "Eleanor," he began, "about the letter *" she cut him off gently. "You were right in one thing, Thomas. Ivy made you feel alive, but the truth is, I was dying. Slowly, quietly, you didn't even notice. And when I finally began living again, you showed up just like before, only when something was missing. I made a mistake," he said. "I realize that now." She took a slow breath. "No, you made a choice. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. Leaving your wife of 40 years for someone new, that's a decision." He blinked, wounded. But she wasn't done. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm just not interested in being someone's backup plan." With that, she smiled softly, turned away, and walked toward her painting, The Phoenix. As the night wore on, strangers came and went, praising her work. She exchanged numbers with a few art lovers, even received an invitation to a women's retreat for creatives over 60. She accepted without hesitation. Back home, Eleanor sat by the fireplace and read the final page of her journal. The same journal that had once captured her despair now bore the proof of her rebirth. She opened a fresh page and wrote, "He left, thinking I would crumble, but I didn't. I rebuilt. I loved myself enough to rise, and in doing so, I found something better than a man found me." She closed the journal and looked up at the ceiling, a smile playing on her lips. Outside, the rain had returned, but this time, it didn't feel like morning. It felt like cleansing. Eleanor stood in front of her mirror, applying a subtle layer of rouge to her cheeks. The room around her glowed with late afternoon light, golden rays spilling through the curtains like gentle fire. Her reflection was steady, self-assured. Silver hair was styled loosely, framing her face in soft waves. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress that flowed with ease, matching the silk scarf tied around her neck. She looked radiant, not in the artificial sense, but in the quiet, dignified way that comes only from surviving something, soul-breaking and refusing to stay broken. Tonight was the community fundraiser gala annual event she had attended a few times with Thomas, always in the background, always unnoticed. This year was different. Her art was being featured as part of the evening's exhibit. Her name, Eleanor Grace, had been printed clearly on the program, and 3 of her most powerful paintings had been selected for display. The invitation had read, "Come celebrate the voices that rise through the cracks." It could not have been more fitting. She arrived at the venue alone, stepping out of the taxi with quiet poise. The hall buzzed with warm chatter, flickering lights, and soft jazz playing in the background. A few people greeted her by name now, some because of the gallery, others because of the recent whispers about her transformation. They saw in her what she had recently begun to see in herself, resilience wrapped in grace. As she moved through the crowd, Eleanor felt no nerves, no desire to impress. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself. She was simply there, in her truth, owning her space. The night moved gently forward. Glasses clinked. Laughter bloomed across small circles. Her paintings drew attention. One, in particular, titled Wings and Silence, showed a woman mid-flight, her face turned away, her arms extended like she was leaping, not escaping, but claiming. A woman Eleanor barely knew approached her. I stood in front of this painting for 10 minutes, she said softly. It made me feel like it's okay to walk away. Eleanor smiled. Sometimes, walking away is how we learn to arrive. They exchanged a few more words before the woman moved on. Eleanor was sipping a sparkling elderflower drink, savoring the moment when she felt someone approach behind her. The air shifted. She turned slowly. Thomas stood there in a muted gray suit. He looked smaller, somehow, both physically and in presence. There were more lines on his face than she remembered. His tie was slightly askew. He held a glass of red wine but didn't seem to be drinking it. "Hi," he said, his voice quiet. Eleanor nodded. "Thomas, *" He glanced around the room, then at her paintings. "These are yours." "Yes." "They're powerful." "Thank you." A long silence stretched between them. He studied her face, searching for familiarity, but what he found instead was transformation. "You look different," he said. "I am different." He smiled weakly. "I've been meaning to talk to you." She folded her arms loosely. "You wrote a letter. I read it." "Ivy left," he said, tone full of subdued shame. "She said she wasn't ready for something serious. I guess I thought I could start over with her, but it was never real." Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. "I was wrong," he continued. "So wrong. About everything. I left the best part of my life behind." She took a breath, steady and calm. "No, Thomas, you left the part of your life you thought would always wait for you. But I wasn't the best part of your life. You just didn't realize I was the best part of you. And now I've taken that part back." He looked wounded, but not surprised. "I miss you," he whispered. Eleanor shook her head gently. "You miss comfort. You miss the way I made life easy. You don't even know the woman standing in front of you now." "I want to." She smiled, but it was more of a farewell than a welcome. "I spent 40 years being someone for you, and now, finally, I'm being someone for myself. You were part of my story, Thomas, but you are no longer part of my plot." He looked down at his shoes, then back at her. "I deserve that." She nodded. "You do." He lingered a moment longer, then gave a small, tired nod and walked away into the crowd. Eleanor didn't watch him leave. She turned back to her painting, feeling a wave of peace settle over her. Revenge, she realized, didn't always come in flames. Sometimes it came in silence, in walking into a room glowing with your own light, in not needing to say, "Look what you lost," because it was already written on every inch of your being. The rest of the evening passed in a gentle blur of conversations. compliments, and laughter. A few women asked her about her process, her inspiration. She told them the truth that heartbreak had opened a door, and she had decided to walk through it rather than shut it again. By the time she returned home, it was past midnight. The house was still and glowing faintly from the porch light she'd forgotten to turn off. She poured herself a glass of chamomile tea, sat on the porch swing, and let the cool breeze brush against her skin. The moon was high and silver, full and bold, just like she felt inside her heart. She felt no lingering bitterness, only gratitude. Gratitude for her own strength, for the discovery of parts of herself she'd forgotten, for the knowledge that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had also become the reason she finally came alive. She pulled out her journal and began to write. He said he missed me, but I am not the woman he left. She no longer lives here. The woman he sees now is the one I buried beneath years of silence, now returned in full bloom, and she does not wait. She walks. As she set the pen down, she smiled. She hadn't won in the way most people define revenge. There were no cruel words, no slamming of doors, no dramatic proclamations. But her revenge was absolute. Because she had become everything he thought she couldn't be without him, and more. And that was the sweetest victory of all. The morning after the gala, Eleanor awoke to sunlight pouring through her bedroom window, a soft breeze dancing through the curtains, and the lingering scent of her lavender pillow mist. It had been the best sleep she'd had in months. There was no anxiety pressing on her chest, no restless tossing or turning, no phantom echoes of Thomas's voice, only a calm, steady sense of arrival. Something inside her had finally settled. She slipped out of bed and stood barefoot on the hardwood floor. The coolness grounded her. She stretched, walked to the mirror, and looked at her reflection with quiet satisfaction. There were still the familiar lines etched into her skin, the gray hair around her temples, the slight softness around her neck, but the woman who looked back at her no longer seemed defeated. She looked steady, alive, strong. The gala had been more than a success, it had been a declaration. Her art had spoken for her in ways words never could, and the moment with Thomas Final had brought a long-awaited closure. She no longer needed his apology, nor his presence, nor his regret. He was a closed chapter, a lesson written in ink, never to be erased, but no longer painful to reread. As she moved about her kitchen, brewing coffee and humming a tune, she noticed her phone vibrating on the countertop. It was her eldest son, Adam. Mom, he greeted. I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. Joel and I saw the photos from the gala. You looked amazing. Eleanor smiled, stirring her coffee. Thank you, darling. It was a good night. You're incredible. And I wanted to ask, would you come speak at my community group next month? It's for women dealing with life transitions. Your story, what you've done, it could really help them. She blinked, surprised. Me? Speak. Yes, you, he said, warmly. You don't even realize how powerful you are, do you? Eleanor chuckled. I'm beginning to. They spoke a little longer, catching up, and when the call ended, Eleanor stood in her kitchen and let the words echo in her mind. You're powerful. For decades, she had been told she was gentle, kind, patient, but powerful. That was a new word, and it fit. She opened her journal and wrote the phrase across a fresh page. Power rediscovered. Later that day, Eleanor visited the local community center where the gallery pieces had been moved temporarily for display. It was a sunny Saturday, and several visitors walked the hallway slowly, pausing at each canvas. She noticed an older couple standing in front of the woman who stayed when he left. The woman held the man's hand, tears in her eyes. Eleanor approached gently. Thank you for spending time with her, she said, gesturing toward the painting. The woman looked at her, eyes wide. This is yours. Yes. It's like you painted my story. Eleanor nodded. Maybe I did. Maybe it's all of ours, in some way. The couple smiled through their emotions, and Eleanor felt her chest tighten, not with pain, but with pride. Her wounds had become windows. Her art wasn't just therapy anymore. It was a lifeline for others, too. Back at home that evening, she gathered the courage to write an email to the women's retreat organizers she had met at the gala. They had invited her to lead a workshop on healing through art. She hadn't answered immediately, Certainty still crept in at times, but now she was ready. She clicked send. Then she sat back, watching the fading sunlight spill across her wooden floor, the colors mirroring the hues in her latest unfinished painting. The canvas on her easel was different from the others. Not a storm, not a flight. This one showed a woman with her back to the viewer, walking into a field of wildflowers, her arms open, her scarf caught midair like a flag. The horizon glowed orange and violet, an ending. Yes, but also a beginning. The doorbell rang. Eleanor wiped her hands on a cloth and answered it. June stood on the porch, holding a small box. Asterisk, I thought you might want this, she said. I found it at the charity bookshop. They're starting a display on women in the arts. They want to include local voices. I told them about you. Asterisk. Eleanor took the box, eyes curious. Inside was a blank hardcover book with gold-edged pages. A journal, elegant and pristine. Asterisk. They want to publish short essays, stories of strength. I figured maybe you'd want to submit something. Asterisk. Eleanor smiled, touched. You've always believed in me, June. Asterisk. I've seen you come back from the dead, she said plainly. Of course I believe in you. Asterisk. That night, Eleanor sat at her desk, the blank book in front of her, and began to write her story, not for a diary, not for therapy, but for the world, for every woman who had been left behind, for every wife who had been discarded, for every mother who had poured herself out until there was nothing left. She titled it, The Bloom After Winter. Asterisk. The words flowed from her like breath, steady, healing. She wrote about the betrayal, the silence, the reckoning. She wrote about painting, about walking, about crying in the dark and laughing at nothing. She wrote about finding pieces of herself in old poems and new friends, in fresh curtains and unfamiliar songs. She wrote about the night Thomas came back and how it wasn't rage she felt, but release. Asterisk. When she finished the first essay, she closed the book and sat in the dim light, feeling more whole than she ever had. Then she received a text from an unknown number. Asterisk. Hi, this is Ivy. Her breath caught. She stared at the screen, blinking in disbelief. The message continued. I know I have no right to reach out, but I wanted you to know I left him. I think you already know that. I'm sorry, not just for being with him, but for not seeing you. I didn't know what I was walking into. He never talked about you. It was like you didn't exist. I only learned about your art recently. You're extraordinary. I hope you're okay. I truly, truly do. Asterisk. Eleanor put the phone down, emotions swirling. She didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Ivy had taken something, yes, but she had also given Eleanor a strange and unexpected gift. Asterisk. Her own absence had forced Eleanor to meet herself. Asterisk. She walked to the window, looked out at the night sky, and whispered, I forgive you, not for Ivy's sake, for her own. Asterisk. Forgiveness wasn't about releasing others. It was about freeing herself from the rope of bitterness she no longer needed to carry. Asterisk. The next morning, Eleanor got up early, dressed simply in a white blouse and denim jeans, and went to the garden. It had been months since she tended it. The roses were overgrown, and ivy of all things had crept along the wall again. She laughed softly, shook her head, and began pulling it down, trimming branches, breathing in the scent of earth and possibility. Asterisk. It felt symbolic, cutting back the wild, reclaiming beauty, choosing growth. Asterisk. Later that day, as she painted again, she realized she no longer needed to title her pieces out of pain. They could emerge from joy, from peace, from curiosity. Asterisk. She titled her new canvas, First Light. Asterisk. She painted a sun rising behind tall trees, its rays spilling over a figure walking into the dawn, not escaping, just continuing. That evening, she opened her journal and wrote, The world broke me once, but then I stitched myself together with brushes and words. And now, I walk softer, but with purpose. I speak slower, but with meaning. I love smaller, but deeper. I am not who I was, and that is my greatest gift. Asterisk. There was only one chapter left in this story, one that wasn't about healing anymore, but about thriving. The woman who had been abandoned had become the woman no one could overlook. Asterisk. And soon, she would no longer just tell her story. Asterisk. She would teach others how to tell theirs. Asterisk. The sun was just beginning to rise when Eleanor opened her eyes, its golden rays filtering through the linen curtains of her bedroom and casting soft patterns across the wall. The warmth of the morning light embraced her like a gentle whisper, quiet and reassuring. She lay still for a moment, listening to the faint birdsong outside her window, her breath steady, her heart light. It was not a special morning, no occasion, no planned event, but something in the air told her that life had turned a corner, and so had she. She rose, her movements fluid, calm. There was no heaviness in her limbs, no weight pressing on her chest. The mirror reflected a woman at peace. Eleanor brushed her hair, tied it loosely behind her head, and chose a simple linen dress with a soft floral pattern. She added earrings, tiny pearls she hadn't worn in years, and smiled at her reflection. Not because she needed to look a certain way for anyone else, but because she felt like celebrating herself. Not the version that had once been broken, but the woman who had found her way back to life. The house, once a tomb of memories, now hummed with new energy. Paintings adorned the walls, her own creations, vibrant and fearless. A pile of journals, sketchbooks, and letters sat on her desk beside her typewriter. Even the kitchen, once dim and mechanical in its routines, felt alive now. It smelled of fresh herbs, of toasted bread and lemon zest, of comfort, of choice. Eleanor spent the morning in her garden, trimming the rose bushes and planting new seeds. She'd cleared the ivy weeks ago, its symbolic removal from her wall, still fresh in her memory, but now, in its place, she had chosen jasmine, morning glory, and lavender, things that climbed gently, bloomed softly, and gave more than they took. Around midday, she received a phone call from the community center. Her workshop had been finalized. Miss Grace, the coordinator said warmly, "We've titled it The Art of Beginning Again. The response has been overwhelming. We already have 20 women signed up." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, not with nerves, but with gratitude. "That's wonderful," she said. "Thank you for the opportunity." They're thanking you. You've become a bit of an inspiration, you know. After the call ended, Eleanor sat in silence, absorbing the words. Inspiration, a title she had never imagined for herself, especially not at 67. For most of her adult life, she had defined herself by her marriage, her role, her routine, but now, the world saw her for who she was, and more importantly, she saw herself clearly. That afternoon, her son Joel dropped by with his wife and 2 daughters. The little girls ran through the hallway, their laughter echoing like music in the walls. Eleanor baked cookies with them, smiling as flour dusted the air, and little fingers snuck spoonfuls of dough. She sat with them on the porch swing, reading stories and watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. Joel came out quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. Mom, he said, handing her one. "I still can't believe how far you've come in just a few months." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Neither can I, but I think I had to fall apart completely before I could see the pieces I wanted to keep." He nodded, then hesitated. "Have you heard from Dad again?" Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, and I think that's for the best." Joel sighed. "I still don't understand why he did it." Eleanor sipped her tea, watching her granddaughters chase butterflies. "Sometimes," she said, "people aren't who we thought they were, and sometimes we aren't who we thought we were either. He made his choice, and I finally made mine." Joel reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're not just our mother anymore. You're our hero." That night, as the house quieted and the stars peeked through the velvet sky, Eleanor walked through each room slowly. She paused at every painting, every corner she had transformed, every book she had added to her shelf. This home, once shared and shadowed, now reflected only her truth. She returned to her desk and opened a leather-bound notebook. Inside were the essays. She had been compiling one for each chapter of her healing. The working title was still The Bloom After Winter, but tonight she had an idea for the final piece. A letter to herself. She took a deep breath and began to write. "Dear Eleanor, you made it. You walked through fire, through silence, through sorrow so deep you thought it might drown you. You stood alone in a house full of memories and chose not to run but to rebuild. You let yourself grieve just for a man who left, but for the woman you used to be. You loved deeply, too deeply, sometimes. You forgave too quickly. You gave more than you should have. But you also grew. You rediscovered your voice, your art, your purpose. You stopped asking for permission to take up space. You realized your value was never tied to someone else's presence. Asterisk, you turned your wounds into brushstrokes, your tears into ink, your solitude into strength. You became your own rescue. And now, look at you. Not just surviving, thriving, not just moving on, rising. Asterisk, never forget how far you've come, and never again forget what you deserve. Asterisk, with love, Eleanor. Asterisk, she read it aloud, her voice steady, her eyes misty but proud. Asterisk, the clock ticked softly in the background as she slipped the letter between the pages and closed the notebook. Asterisk, her final chapter wasn't about revenge. It was about return. Not to the life she once had, but to the woman she was always meant to be. Asterisk, a week later, Eleanor stood in front of a room full of women, some older, some younger, all carrying invisible weights. They watched her with curiosity, some with hope. She smiled warmly. Asterisk, I'm not here to teach you how to forget pain, she began. I'm here to show you that even after the deepest heartbreak, we can still choose joy, still choose art, still choose ourselves. Asterisk, as she spoke, she felt their hearts softening, shoulders relaxing, tears brimming. Asterisk, they saw her not as a woman abandoned but as a woman who refused to remain forgotten. Asterisk, after the session, one woman approached her, trembling slightly. Asterisk, my husband left me last year. I thought I'd never smile again. Asterisk, Eleanor took her hands gently. You will, not because of what he did, but because of what you'll do with what's left. Asterisk, that night, as Eleanor returned home, she found an envelope in the mailbox. The name on the corner made her pause. Thomas Grice. She opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, an old one. Their wedding day. Tucked behind it was a short note. Asterisk, I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll remember the love we once shared and not just how it ended. I am sorry for all of it. Asterisk, Eleanor stared at the photo for a long time. She remembered the girl she had been. Innocent, hopeful, full of faith in forever. She closed her eyes and silently thanked that girl for surviving. Asterisk, then, she tucked the note away, not out of sentiment, but out of closure. The final words had been said. Later, she lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the porch as the sky turned pink with twilight. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of her new garden lavender, jasmine, earth, and hope. Asterisk, a soft breeze passed, lifting the corner of the tablecloth and brushing against her cheek like a kiss from the universe. Asterisk, and in that moment, Eleanor knew she had not just taken back her life, she had rewritten it, on her own terms, in her own language. The woman who had been left behind was now the woman everyone looked up to, and she would never again be lost in someone else's shadow. She was, at last, her own light.